All right, friends, doctor here. If you're doing keto, carnivore, or trying to break a stubborn stall, this video is for you. Today, I'm reacting to one of the most misunderstood ideas in nutrition, zero-carb foods. Beef didn't become controversial because it stopped nourishing humans. It became controversial because modern disease needed a scapegoat. And when you strip away the noise and look at the biology, the story becomes almost uncomfortable in how clear it is. For over 2 million years, human brains expanded, hormones stabilized, bones strengthened, and populations survived harsh climates largely because of large ruminant meat. And when you eat beef today, you are consuming a food that delivers complete protein with zero carbohydrates, meaning it does not raise blood glucose, does not provoke an insulin surge, and does not trap the body in fat storage mode. A fact that matters deeply when more than 90% of adults show signs of insulin resistance, a condition that quietly damages blood vessels, brains, and mitochondria long before diabetes is diagnosed. Beef provides all 9 essential amino acids in proportions that match human muscle tissue almost perfectly, which is why studies repeatedly show higher satiety, reduced hunger hormones like grain, and improved lean mass retention when beef replaces carbohydrate-heavy foods. And this matters because muscle is not cosmetic tissue. It is a metabolic organ that clears glucose, stabilizes insulin, and predicts longevity better than body weight ever will. The iron in beef is hemi-iron, meaning it is absorbed at rates up to 5 times higher than plant iron. And iron deficiency remains one of the most common nutrient deficiencies in the world, especially among women, leading to fatigue, hair loss, anxiety, cold intolerance, and impaired thyroid function. Yet, many people unknowingly worsen this deficiency by avoiding red meat while relying on iron sources their bodies cannot efficiently use. Beef is one of the richest dietary sources of vitamin B12, a nutrient so essential to nerve insulation and brain signaling that deficiency can mimic dementia, depression, and irreversible nerve damage. And here's the unsettling part. B12 deficiency can occur even when blood tests appear normal, especially in people consuming low-meat diets or taking acid-blocking medications, which reduce absorption and silently accelerate neurological decline. Zinc from beef directly supports immune function, wound healing, testosterone production, and insulin signaling. And research shows zinc deficiency impairs the pancreas's ability to store and release insulin properly, creating a vicious cycle where people are blamed for poor blood sugar control while being nutritionally undermined by the very dietary advice meant to help them. The fat in beef is not inert fuel. It is biochemical instruction providing saturated and monounsaturated fats that stabilize cell membranes, support hormone synthesis, and reduce the need for constant glucose intake. And when insulin remains low, the body is finally allowed to access stored fat, which is why ketogenic diets centered around beef consistently show reductions in triglycerides, improvements in HDL cholesterol, and decreased markers of inflammation despite decades of warnings predicting the opposite. Grass-fed beef contains higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, compounds associated with improved insulin sensitivity and reduced visceral fat. But even grain-fish beef retains the fundamental metabolic advantage of being carb-free, which means for someone trapped in blood sugar swings, fatigue, cravings, and failed diets, beef can feel like metabolic silence for the first time in years. When people say beef raises cholesterol, they often ignore that cholesterol is not a toxin, but a repair molecule, a hormone precursor, and a key component of brain tissue. And studies consistently show that dietary cholesterol has little effect on blood cholesterol in most individuals. While insulin resistance and chronic inflammation drive the dangerous lipid patterns actually associated with heart disease, there is a reason patients with metabolic syndrome often see improvements in blood markers when they replace refined carbohydrates with beef. Because insulin, not fat, drives hepatic fat production, small dense LDL particles, and arterial inflammation. From an evolutionary standpoint, humans lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C efficiently because meat-based diets supplied enough to survive. And while modern diets have shifted dramatically, the underlying physiology has not changed. which is why reintroducing beef often resolves joint pain, skin issues, and fatigue that were never traced back to nutrient insufficiency but should have been. Beef is also one of the most efficient ways to meet protein needs without excess calories or carbohydrate load. And this becomes critical as people age because anabolic resistance increases and inadequate protein accelerates sarcopenia, frailty, and loss of independence. Outcomes far more predictive of mortality than cholesterol numbers on a lab sheet. When you cook beef and leave the fat intact, you are preserving the very components that trigger satiety hormones like peptide Y and CCK, signals that tell the brain you are nourished and safe, reducing the urge to snack, binge, or seek quick dopamine from sugar. And this is not a willpower issue. It is neurobiology responding to adequate nutrition. The fear of beef was never rooted in randomized controlled trials showing harm in metabolically healthy humans. It was built on observational data confounded by smoking, sugar intake, and processed foods. And when those variables are controlled, beef repeatedly fails to show the villainous effects it was accused of. In a world where ultra-processed foods dominate, beef remains one of the few foods that requires no ingredient list, no metabolic decoding, and no blood sugar apology. And when people struggling with obesity, diabetes, or brain fog replace cereal, bread, and heart-healthy snacks with a simple cut of beef, the results often feel dramatic, not because beef is magical, but because the body finally stops fighting itself. Beef does not spike insulin, does not ferment in the gut, does not require fortification to be nutritionally complete, and does not demand metabolic gymnastics to be tolerated, and for a population drowning in chronic disease. That simplicity is not primitive. It is profoundly therapeutic. Because sometimes the most powerful intervention is not adding something new, but returning to the food that shaped human physiology in the first place. Lamb is one of the most nutritionally misunderstood foods on the planet. Not because the science is weak, but because modern nutrition stopped telling the whole story. And when you follow the data instead of the dogma, lamb quietly emerges as one of the most metabolically powerful foods a human can eat, especially in a world overwhelmed by insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, and hormonal collapse. Long before grocery stores existed, lamb and other grazing ruminants were survival foods, sustaining humans through environments where crops failed, winters were brutal, and blood sugar stability meant the difference between life and death. And the human body adapted to thrive on the exact nutrient profile lamb provides. Zero carbohydrates, complete protein, and fats that communicate safety to the brain and endocrine system. Every bite of lamb delivers amino acids in ratios that mirror human tissue, meaning less metabolic waste, less nitrogen stress, and greater muscle preservation. And this matters because loss of muscle is not just aging. It is metabolic failure strongly associated with insulin resistance, frailty, and early mortality. Lamb is uniquely rich in omega-3 fatty acids when pasture-raised. And unlike plant omega-3s that must be converted inefficiently, lamb provides bioavailable EPA and DHA, the same anti-inflammatory fats found in fish, which are directly incorporated into brain tissue, cell membranes, and mitochondria. And research consistently links higher DHA levels to improved insulin sensitivity, lower triglycerides, and reduced risk of neurodegenerative disease. One of the most overlooked compounds in lamb is conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA, a fatty acid shown in both animal and human studies to reduce visceral fat, improve body composition, and modulate immune signaling. And visceral fat is not cosmetic fat. It is hormonally active tissue that secretes inflammatory cytokines, disrupts insulin signaling, and predicts cardiovascular risk more accurately than body weight or BMI. Lamb is also an extraordinary source of zinc, a mineral required for over 300 enzymatic reactions, including those that govern immune defense, wound healing, thyroid conversion, and testosterone production. And zinc deficiency has been repeatedly linked to impaired insulin secretion, increased oxidative stress, and weakened immune response. Yet it remains widespread in populations that avoid red meat while consuming high-fit plant foods that block mineral absorption. The iron in lamb is heme iron, the form the human body evolved to absorb efficiently. And iron deficiency continues to be one of the leading causes of fatigue, hair thinning, shortness of breath, and poor exercise tolerance worldwide, especially among women. Yet, replacing iron-rich foods with fortified grains often worsens the problem because non-heme iron competes poorly for absorption and is tightly regulated by inflammation. Lamb provides vitamin B12 in a form that requires no conversion, a nutrient essential for myelin formation, DNA synthesis, and neurological integrity. And B12 deficiency is increasingly common not only among vegans, but among older adults and people taking acid-suppressing medications, leading to symptoms that mimic anxiety disorders, memory loss, and neuropathy long before anemia appears on a lab test. The fat in lamb is not something to trim away because saturated and monounsaturated fats stabilize cell membranes and reduce the need for constant glucose intake. And when insulin remains low, fat oxidation increases, hunger hormones normalize, and energy becomes steady instead of reactive. Lamb does not spike blood sugar, does not provoke an insulin surge, and does not feed the cycle of cravings that keeps people trapped in constant eating. And this single metabolic characteristic alone makes it profoundly therapeutic for individuals struggling with diabetes, prediabetes, or unexplained fatigue. Unlike processed meats, lamb requires no preservatives, no sugar, and no chemical stabilizers to be palatable. And this matters because ultra-processed foods now make up more than half of calories consumed in many countries, driving inflammation, gut permeability, and metabolic dysfunction at a scale never seen before in human history. From a hormonal perspective, lamb provides cholesterol, the raw material for steroid hormones like cortisol, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. And despite decades of fear-based messaging, cholesterol is not a dietary toxin, but a repair molecule essential for cell signaling and brain function. And low cholesterol has been associated in multiple studies with increased risk of depression, hemorrhagic stroke, and hormonal imbalance. When people are told to fear foods like lamb, they are often unknowingly pushed toward diets higher in refined carbohydrates and seed oils, which elevate insulin, damage mitochondria, and oxidize LDL particles. The very process blamed on saturated fat, despite overwhelming evidence that insulin resistance and oxidative stress are the true drivers of cardiovascular disease. Lamb also contains carnitine, a compound critical for transporting fatty acids into mitochondria where they are burned for energy. And without adequate carnitine, fat metabolism stalls, leading to fatigue, reduced exercise tolerance, and impaired metabolic flexibility. In cultures where lamb remains a dietary staple, rates of metabolic disease were historically low until refined sugars and industrial oils entered the food supply. A pattern repeated across continents and generations, suggesting that the issue was never lamb, but the removal of nutrient-dense animal foods combined with the rise of hyperpalatable carbohydrates. Lamb is deeply satiating, triggering peptide when cytokinin, hormones that signal fullness to the brain, reducing overeating without conscious restriction. And this is why people who incorporate lamb into ketogenic or low insulin diets often report effortless calorie reduction without hunger, something no willpower-based diet can sustainably achieve. As people age, their ability to synthesize muscle protein declines, a phenomenon known as anabolic resistance. And without dense bioavailable protein like that found in lamb, muscle loss accelerates, increasing the risk of falls, fractures, and loss of independence. Outcomes far more predictive of mortality than cholesterol levels or body weight. Lamb does not require fortification to be complete, does not rely on fiber to be tolerated, and does not depend on blood sugar swings to provide energy. And in a metabolic environment overloaded with stimulation, that simplicity becomes healing. When lamb replaces foods that spike glucose and insulin, inflammation markers often fall, triglycerides drop, HDL rises, and energy stabilizes. Not because lamb is a miracle food, but because it aligns with human physiology rather than fighting it. The modern fear of lamb was built on assumptions, not randomized controlled trials showing harm in metabolically healthy humans. And when variables like smoking, sugar intake, and processed food consumption are controlled, lamb consistently fails to demonstrate the damage it was accused of causing.